Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Such a pleasure today to be here with the Poet Laureate of California, Lee Herrick. This is a presentation through the Los Angeles Public Library, which was set up through the writing class that I do for the literacy programs at LA Public Library. So pleased to have Lee Herrick, who is the author of three poems. He's going to read three poems, three poetry books, rather. He's going to read three poems today and talk about them. He is a teacher of writing at Fresno City College, and it's indeed a pleasure to welcome him to the class today. And I encourage all of you to enter comments or questions in the chat, and as many as we can get to, we will. So good afternoon and welcome, Lee.
Hi, thank you so much, Robert, for having me. And thank you to Christina also, and Lisa, and the Los Angeles Public Library. I'm really happy to be here. Libraries, quite frankly, changed my life as a boy. I would spend hours and hours reading everything that I could. And at that time, as a boy, it was anything sports related. I loved reading about sports, and then eventually started reading novels and discovered poetry. And so it's been quite a journey now. I'm in my early 50s, and I've lived here in California for most of my life. I was born in South Korea, and I was adopted when I was 10 months old. I've never met my birth family or my first family, but still close with my adoptive family. I was raised in the East Bay Area, and I say this because as California Poet Laureate, it's been an incredible joy to see in real time and in person and on Zoom or any kind of format online. I've been in small towns that I had not heard of, and there will be a thriving poetry community. And so I'm very happy to be here. So thank you, Robert, for having me. And to the students in the class and anyone else listening, I do hope if you have questions that you can type them in. I want to try to be as helpful and open as I can. So I think the format that we're going to follow here is that I'll read a poem, and then I think we'll open it up to discussion. And then I'll read another poem and discussion and so on. Okay.
That sounds great, Lee. Before we do that, I just wanted to ask you if you could identify the moment when you began writing poetry.
There are a couple of ways I always think of answering that. And the first is more figurative, but I want to believe that I was hearing or possibly even composing poems in my body or in my heart or in my mind in Korea. I mean, of course, I wasn't literally writing a poem when I was 8 months old, but I think, or I want to believe that I had that kind of music in me from the country where I was born. But more specifically, the first poem I remember writing is probably when I was 8 or 9 years old. I always used to love the sound of words, and I still love the sound of words. I loved rhyme and slant rhyme and what it reminded me of, just a word like pasta, what that would evoke or what that would make me think of. So yeah, 5th or 6th grade, I think, is when I remember writing my first poem. And then in high school, I had just incredible teachers who showed us more poetry. And I was a very shy, quiet student in class. I was often the only person of color. With my friends and family, I was very social and very outgoing. But in class, I was very quiet and shy. But I was really absorbing all that poetry. Um, and then into college. So yeah, but I think it started around fifth or sixth grade when I was maybe 11, 12, 10, something like that.
Uh-huh. Right. Well, it's been a long journey since then, and I in this class, as we have talked about, which is a writing class, really, and this is a larger uh, version of it, really, today. I've always say that writing leads to reading, and reading leads to writing. How would you comment a bit about that? Do you feel that learning to write is based on reading other people, and reading other people leads you back into a circle?
Uh-huh. I agree 100%. I think you put that very well. In my experience, we're reading first. That's our first experience. Well, hmm, maybe not in every case.
Okay.
Um, but in my experience, I was read to books as a child, or I was reading in school, certainly. Um, and I remember reading so many stories in school that were interesting and beautiful, and in some cases moving. For example, I remember reading um, F. Scott Fitzgerald's novels and Shakespeare's plays and books like that. And as I was reading, I remember thinking that I had experiences too. And so I think a lot of writers' impulse is to enter the conversation, or at the very least, um, make real what is in their heart or what they have lived or how they see it. That was my feeling. Like I remember thinking, I want to write a story, or I want to write a poem. And then we're writing, and then we need more fuel. I don't know any writer who doesn't read um, actively and regularly. It's just necessary. A musician is going to listen to music. A painter is going to observe paintings, and so a writer is not a writer without reading. They fuel each other, I think.
Very, very true. Very, very good answer. Thank you for that. I wonder if you'd like to begin to read the first poem now, and we can talk about it after you've done that.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Um, the first poem I'm going to read is called My California, and um, this is for my second book. And I say that because it came out in 2008, and it was a time where I started to think that even as a Korean adoptee, and I often felt like an outsider, that this was my state too. And I like to say this, whether it applies to you or not, that if anyone has ever felt like that outsider, or that this is not your state, um, I would welcome you and humbly say that you are as Californian as anyone, whether you're documented or not. So anyway, I'll just read the poem.
Sure.
It's called My California. Here, an olive votive keeps the sunset lit. The Korean 20-somethings talk about hyphens, graduate school, and good pot. And a group of four at a window table in Carpinteria discuss the quality of wines in Napa Valley versus Lodi. Here, in my California, the streets remember the Chicano poet whose songs still bank off Fresno's beer-soaked gutters and almond trees in partial blossom. Here, in my California, we fish out long noodles from the pho with such accuracy you'd know we'd done this before. In Fresno, the bullets tire of themselves and begin to pray 5 times a day. In Fresno, we hope for less of the police state and more of a state of grace. In my California, you can watch the sun go down like in your California. On the ledge of the pregnant 22nd century, the one with a bounty of peaches and grapes, red onions and the good salsa, wine and japchae. Here in my California, paperbacks are free. Farmers markets are 24 hours a day and always packed. The trees and water have no nails in them. The priests eat well. The homeless eat well. Here in my California, everywhere is Chinatown. Everywhere is K-Town. Everywhere is Armenia Town. Everywhere, a little Italy. Less Confederacy. No internment in the valley. Better history texts for the juniors. In my California, free sounds and free touch. Free questions, free answers, free songs from parents and poets, those hopeful bodies of light.
Thank you for that, Lee. You know, when I hear you speaking about the very concrete, very specific markers in your poem, they are little spots of surprise to me as I hear you reading it in a larger story, which is kind of a prayer. It's kind of it is asking for things to be better. It is observing what things are nowadays, and it's sort of leaving us open for improvement. And grace, as you say in the poem. Would you care to comment some about how that sort of combination of the everyday and then the metaphoric and even metaphysical seem to coexist in a very warm relationship?
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate that, Robert. I would love to think that someone might read it in that way, whether it's a tone of prayer or certainly hope. The poem was very much that, you know. My thinking early on with the poem was to get at some of what I think are California's traumas and tragedies. You know, there are references to um, internment, Japanese internment. There are references to bullets and a police state, which I think can be problematic. Um, and even just ordinary images and ordinary places or references, like you say. You know, my California here, coming from Fresno, where I live in the Central Valley, it's very agricultural. And so I have great reverence and respect for farmers, you know, the food, the grapes and the peaches and the salsa that are mentioned in the poem. So those are things that I think of with California. And then also at the same time, I don't know what we would be without hope. On either end of the spectrum, someone who thinks they need none, someone who thinks, whether it's a civilization or an individual who thinks that hope is something just to dismiss, would concern me. And likewise, someone who is in a time of great struggle or difficulty, I would hope for and hope that they have that kind of imagination and belief that things can be better, you know. Not to get too hung up on libraries and books and writing, but maybe that's why we're here. I think that's one of the great things that books can do and poetry can do, is show us um, what can be possible.
The power of words is something that, and the power of the printed word, although we now live in an age of everything but luckily still books are being printed, in hard copy, thank goodness. But your writing seems to embrace a positive but realistic view of the world as it is, and perhaps more specifically, the world of California. Um, it's kind of a challenge to make it better. I think that the poem exists as a here is what I see. How many of you can offer something better to improve our lives? In this wonderfully diverse state, and living
Mhm.
among the agricultural um, zones of California certainly does, in fact, bring you close to the immigrant experience, brings you close to some inequities largely. I have a question here from one of the students. Which authors do you like to read today?
Mm. Oh, that's a good question. So I'm revisiting some of the Polish poets, Milosz and people like that, who I've always loved. Um, some of my favorites that I'm reading currently, and quite frankly, they're always with me. There's a poet from Fresno originally, and he's lived in the Los Angeles area. Is former California and also a former U.S. Poet Laureate Juan Felipe Herrera. So I'm always reading his work. I'm reading Patricia Smith, who is a great poet from the Chicago area. She's a good friend and a brilliant and powerful poet. Um, I like to read poems that move me in some way. So those are a couple that I think about. Um, I could probably go on with a longer list, but thank you. I see the question type. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Do you tend to, refer back to classical poets? I mean, that is to say, either 19th century or before. I mean, is that something that, you reconnect to look for inspiration or, make relevant in some way to the world as we have it today?
Hmm. Yeah, I do. Most of what I read is probably contemporary American poetry.
Okay,
And by that I would say, 1970, 80, and on.
okay,
Um, and I largely read. I try to read books that are being published each year, but I'm also mindful of, and I think I need to read poems not only from, say, the 19th century, but also widely across cultures and certain countries. I've
sure.
traveled a fair amount through Latin America and Asia, and so I like reading books in translation. Um, I'm reading a book right now, a Korean poet in translation. Um, the poet's name escapes me right now, but the book title is The World's Lightest Motorcycle. And um, Central American poets have been very formative for me. People like Ruben Dario and Roque Dalton and people like that. But yeah, I think as much as we can read, it's all going to inform our work and enrich our lives. It can just be fun too to read these poems.
Yes, indeed. I see a question here below. Do you write in any language other than English?
I don't. Thank you, Raul. I'm seeing your question here. Um, I don't write fluently in any other language than English, but quite a few poems of mine have referenced words in other languages, or in some cases, used the word from another language. And if primarily that might be an occasional word in Korean and sometimes Spanish. But I don't know about people listening or watching, but I know that I believe you've spent some time back east, Robert, and living in the Los Angeles area. I mean, Los Angeles is like its own country.
Absolutely.
And there's no in my travels, which I think I've traveled to maybe 20, 25 countries, and that might be a lot or it might be very light depending on who you're talking to. But in my experience, there's no country that I've been to that comes close to the diversity of the United States. In Fresno alone, there are over 90 languages spoken, and I love every one of them. So yes, Raul, I try to sprinkle it in, just like a chef. I hope this will make sense, but I always think of a cooking analogy in terms of poetry. A chef might sprinkle in some herb or something from a farmer's market that she found just to change up the soup, to liven up the dish. And I think poets often are trying to do something similar. So yeah, I use as much as I can.
That's great. Absolutely great. Yes, I mean, the food metaphor is such an apt one because in this class we talk so much about food memory, memoir, and this notion in California, which has been taken to a high level, of cross-cultural cooking, or fusion, which is a dirty word perhaps now, but back in the earlier part of the late 20th century. That was certainly a way to make food interesting and to incorporate cultures, on the same plate. And I think that your poetry really, I see that as sort of a plate of many options, many points of entry. The reader can, in fact, identify with some of those things that you're sprinkling in that may draw their attention to move their eye and their comprehension beyond those things. So in a way, it's a lure or an enticement, I think. A question I have is, otherwise, just in general, could you answer? It's a tough one, maybe, or a large topic, but how do you view the role of poetry in modern society or in the world versus any other kind of writing? What is poetry's special place or special power?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that I think of from time to time, and sometimes struggle to come up with what distinguishes it from other art forms or other kinds of writing. So a few things come to mind. One is that poetry is so compact and so compressed, and it's working with precision and what we call the economy of language, right? So because of that, I think that it has a place in society to mark certain occasions with real meaning and precision. So, for example, at a wedding or a wake or a death or a birth, these really significant moments in people's lives are often marked with a poem. Another way I think of it is, and to your question, then, rarely would you read even an excerpt from prose at one of it's often poetry. So maybe the poet has a way of creating so much nuance and beauty in a relatively short space that resonates with people. They don't know why, but it just sounds good, or it resonates with them, or they have maybe a favorite line, like they might have a favorite song lyric. Another thing that I think is that it has a particular impact in a socio-political way that I know other genres do as well, but you know, even starting with the individual, with liberation. You know, the great Audre Lorde talked about transformation through language and voice. She's the one who, in her 1977 speech she gave in Chicago at the MLA conference, she wrote a wonderful essay which includes that famous line that your silence will not protect you. And she talked about needing to speak. She talked about freeing herself from the tyrannies that would otherwise take over her. So I think poetry has the ability to free someone, and through that process open themselves up to engaging in their communities more. And it can take a political appearance. It can, I don't want to get so grandiose to say it can change the world, but I've seen it time and time again where it can save people, it can make change. And I think poetry is unique in that way.
Yes, the compression, the succinctness, the rhythm. Um, do you, in your poetry, as you write, just the sense of process? You know, you start with an opening line that is something that you put down, and then you go from there. Or what is your process? Might you talk about that? Is there one particular process, or a sort of a comfort that a certain way allows you to be creative within?
Yeah. Well, I could certainly speak to my process, but I'll start by saying this, that, you know, if there's anyone watching or listening who writes or is wanting to write, my suggestion would be to write regularly and read regularly to the point where you discover what works best for you. Um, because my process, and I know that's not why you're asking, but my process might not work for someone else. I have friends who swear that a writer has to sit at the desk every day and write for an hour, and I know that can be helpful, but I've never believed that there's only one way to do it.
Mhm.
I experience the world largely through sound. You know, somebody might be very tactile and love textures and sewing and things like that, putting their hands in the food. I experience it through sound, so that's often what I work with most to start a poem, or it's the thing that I remember most that I want to use in a poem. The way a person says something, you know, for example, probably 20 years ago, I was at a coffee shop, and this young man came in, maybe 30 years old, and he just had this glowing look of pride and satisfaction on his face. And he looked like he wanted to tell me something. I didn't know who he was. And he had a large square box with him. And he looked at me and he said, "Hola," assuming I spoke Spanish or something. And he told me that he had just gotten out of prison after a few years and went straight to a shoe store and bought himself a pair of alligator skin boots. And I just remember the sound of his voice when he said that and how he was beaming. And I've always wanted to work that into a poem. So, to your question, it's usually something that I just can't forget. It's usually something that I just really want to write about.
So the sound of words, the sound of other people's words, you tend to incorporate those things into your poetry. So you know you might in your reading of it, just as you just did, there's a certain rhythm and a certain repetition of rhythms I see in your lines. So is that kind of a goal too, that you want to see those things repeat,
Yeah.
and as someone reads it to themselves or reads it aloud, perhaps, which is always nice, they may in fact pick up on that intention
Yes.
after reading it more than once, perhaps,
Yes.
or even the first time round. Uh,
Definitely.
I think it's a great answer. Thank you for that. So let's see. Would you like to read your second poem now?
Yes.
Would love that.
Yes. I'd be happy to. So this is a more recent poem. It's available online, but it's not in the book yet. But I wrote this poem. Um, Actually, I wrote this in about May 2020, I think. Um, and I don't like to think about March and April 2020. You know, it was,
Yes.
to say the least, a devastating time worldwide. But I was contacted by an editor who asked me to write a poem about food and open spaces. And the poem ended up being really about food trucks and street food, which I've always loved. I think just maybe I'll talk more about that after I read the poem. Um,
Okay.
uh, and an Abecedarian is a poem that is 26 lines typically, where every line of the poem starts with the next letter of the alphabet. So um, this is Abecedarian love song for street food. And it has an epigraph from the late Anthony Bourdain, who said, "Street food, I believe, is the salvation of the human race. All praise for the pozole glistening in midday light by the grace of the woman near the comal. In Southern California, Raul Martinez unveiled a mobile downtown gold mine of Al Pastor by a bar in East LA for the drunks, the artists, and the necessary future waiting in line. Praise be to the ice cream truck, glory of the van's slow roll. So praise the van, hut, cart, booth, tent, stand, stall, bike, or truck. I once devoured a tlayuda in Oaxaca City, broke down just as the sunlight burst through the heart of a woman kissing her baby's forehead by the plaza. When I say love, what I mean to say is I dream of you through disaster, malady, drought, or this nightmare anxiety pandemic. Now, even in this late dying, let us praise the 20,000 open-hearted vendors in Bangkok and the glorious pupusas in San Salvador I ate on a bench near a dove. Quesadilla, arepa, tupoki, hallelujah. The banh mi right on the outskirts of Hue. The chili pepper, the cilantro songs, praise the Zocalo saints who brought me to tears with a taco so full of music I almost wept. Under the Beijing moonlight, balsa is made by angels, vendors with wings if you know where to look. On West 53rd and 6th Avenue, New York City, halal, or in Fresno, no xenophobe is welcome. Tell me what to eat. Your chuan, your elote, your mouthful of pure zen, like savory, surprising flashes of heaven.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful indeed. And again, this brings us to the streets. It tells us about how wonderful the food can be, unmediated by a true restaurant or the typical setting to enjoy it. It's spontaneous, and it's exciting and it's varied, and you glory here in the beauty of some of the dishes you've had off of the trucks or in this street food setting. It's magical. And I guess in a
Thank
way,
you.
food can be, it takes us places.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, you're making me think. I love how you read a poem, Robert, or what you take from it. And you know, it has that effect. Food and of course poetry, but there are times where I've eaten something, and maybe it's a combination of being outdoors and hearing the language of that country and the food. Like you say, it's not shipped across the country for 2 days in a truck. Um, it's not frozen. It's not cooked by an apathetic teenager, not to be hard on teenagers, God bless them, right? But
Right.
this food is cooked by someone um, who loves everything about what they're doing. And I've just been so moved by some of the food I have. Those are some of my favorite memories.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's a badge of honor worn by these street vendors who are so in tune with their culture and wishing to share it. Really,
Yeah.
I think that's the beauty is the generosity of spirit that underpins the food that you're buying to enjoy. It's transporting and it's transfixing, and uh,
Mm.
and these are special moments in the lives of, well, many of us, but in California we're so blessed to have this multiplicity of cultures which are evinced by the food on trucks and in open public spaces.
Hmm.
So I certainly do feel the same way, and I think
Mm.
many of us listening to this today can point to moments, as you have so thrillingly in this poem, to moments of a transcendence, that here we are, on our daily routine, and we wind up buying some, a pupusa or a arepa or a, or Roy Choi's, a mashup of, Latin and Korean food, which now goes back a number of years, but certainly that sense of combining cultures, and that
Yeah.
again, as in the first poem, you speak about how California is the crucible for so many cultures. In this second one, I feel like you go even deeper into the everyday. But again, I'm paying particular attention to the pieces in the words in the poem that are the sparkling thing happening, the angel you refer to, the light as the mother kisses the child, just breaking through the plaza. So it's not just about it, it's about so much more than what it states in words.
Hmm.
And that's I guess with a close reading, and I'm speaking to the audience as well, as you have, by gracing us with your poems. Reading something once may not be enough.
Mm.
I think that to get into it further, one needs to read, and you agree that hearing the sound of your own voice reading the poems, that is, those reading it, um, can help you digest,
Hmm.
deeper meanings of the poem.
Hmm.
That's my hope, at any rate.
Yeah, yeah. I hope that's the case. And there are people populating this poem, just like I think that I often think of the people who had a hand in whatever I'm eating at the time. I've got farmers in my family, and even with food trucks, I put Raul Martinez in the poem because he's often cited as the person who started the first food truck in 1974 in Los Angeles,
Mhm.
East LA. And I think, I can't verify this, but of course, I think this may have been after people were carting out food to the fields even before that, where they weren't allowed to leave, so food went out to them, to the fields. And of course, around the world, there are examples where people are somehow involved with it, whether they're growing it, farming it, or just delivering it somewhere. It's really a luxury, I think, to be able to just go eat. It's such a I think it's a luxury I don't ever want to take for granted.
Mm-hmm. I see a few questions that relate to what you've just talked about. One from Justin who says the pauses are sometimes just as important as the words being said. So the stops, the slowing down, the quiet spaces in the poem.
Yeah.
And I see that he has put in a poem from Rudyard Kipling, part of it, ship me somewheres east of Suez where the best falafel is like the worst. On it goes. And then I have another, with your mention of Raoul, you mentioned that, you found in your research that this was the case. And I have a question from one of the viewers. How much, do you do much research in advance of writing poetry? In other words, getting, your facts straight or getting inspiration from a historical fact, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, to this question, and then I wanted to speak briefly to the previous one about pausing.
Right.
I do some research depending on the poem. For example, I was doing some research on Leo Tolstoy's death for a while, and I worked that into a poem. Or especially when it comes to Korean history or certain references, I want to make sure that I have the fact right, so that if I tweak the facts or reimagine it in the poem, I have a factual base from which I'm working, right? So in other words, I know that the word red, R-E-D, is a color, right? Or in whatever language, I know those things. But then in the poem, I can maybe make it something different. So yes, research is a part of what I'm doing at times. What does food mean to me? Oh, Yelena, if I'm pronouncing your name right, these are very good questions. Could talk a long time. What does food mean to me? I think of it as spirituality. I think of food as kind of miraculous, quite frankly. I think of it as joyful. I think of it as, in terms of labor, it's work to cook. It's work to prepare food. I think of it in terms of seasons, kimchi taking months and months and months, if not more, or crops growing a certain time of year. How some crops cannot be picked, or it would not be good to pick them unless it were done by hand. So I think food mean all of these things to me. I think food can also be something that brings people together, but also, unfortunately, I think, at least in the United States, it can be divisive, particularly when it gets corporatized or commodified too much. But food, ultimately, if I had to pick one word, is just joy to me.
There you go.
Yeah. And then just briefly on the pausing, absolutely, that's more of a craft thing. But pausing, or caesura, really is the literary term, or what the Chinese poets would call raising the head. It's the same thing like a drum beat and then the pause before the guitar kicks in, or why the vocalist waits for a few seconds before beginning the chorus. All of those things are as important as any word in the poem. Just like a nonverbal look, a parent or a friend can give somebody a look that's nonverbal, but can be just as impactful as anything spoken.
Well, I don't want to run out of time. I'd love for you to read the third poem that had been decided upon.
Sure.
Thank you.
So this last poem is really just a love song for my birth mother, or my first mother, as we call them. And also, I think a love song for adoptees around the world. How music stays in the body. Your body is a song called Birth or First Mother, a miracle that gave birth to another exquisite song. One song raises 3 boys with a white husband. One song fought an American war overseas. One song leapt from 14 stories high and like a dead bird shattered into the clouds. Most forgot the lyrics to their own bodies or decided to paint abstracts of mountains or moons in the shape of your face. I've been told mothers don't forget the body. I can't remember your face, the shape or story, or how you held me the day I was born, so I wrote 1,000 poems to survive. I want to sing with you in an open field, a simple room, or a quiet bar. I want to hear your opinions about angels. Truth is, angels drink too. Soju spilled on the halo, white wings sticky with gin, as if any mother could forget the music that left her. You should hear how loudly I sing now. I've become a ballad of wild dreams and coping mechanisms. I can breathe now through any fire. I imagine I got this from him or you, my earthly inheritance. Your arms, your sigh, your heavy song. I know all the lyrics. I know all the blood. I know why angels howl into the moonlight.
Thank you. This poem goes deeply into your memory, and and I think as any memory piece is both endearing and shocking and difficult all at once. And I wonder, your reliance upon music and sound, as you mentioned earlier here, as a kind of a respite, maybe? Is it kind of a comfort to you to speak about all these various points of memory in terms of music, in terms of sound?
Mm-hmm.
How does that? How did you? Uh, it seems like so much a part of you that this poem is so deep and raw and unfathomable in certain ways.
Mm-hmm. Yes, music and rhythm figure prominently in my writing, and sound um, is very soothing for me. I think of it like water, particularly in an ocean, where it's just calming. I mean, water can also be devastating, but it's calming, this rhythm. So I'm using a poetic technique. It's the name for it is anaphora, but all it means is really just repeating a word or phrase. One song leapt from 14 stories high. One song raised, that kind of thing. Or, with sound, I was working with meter in the middle of the poem. So, for example, a 2-beat word that goes stressed and then unstressed is like open. So I want to sing with you in an open field, a simple room, a quiet bar. So for me, those are moments in the poem that um, are soothing in some way, but also I think um, meditative and honestly, I was trying to reclaim and create something that's not been a part of my life, and I think we can all do that. We all have people that we miss or that we never knew. or that we lost somehow, or that lost us. Sometimes in the natural course of things, and sometimes in very tragic ways. And so poetry and the music can just be a way to imagine those things that can really be liberating, for me at least.
And the writing of a poem, is it cathartic in a way for you? Getting the words down on paper, is that kind of, as you say, comforting? But is it a sense of having come to terms with a thing,
Mm.
or?
I what I've come to think is that, we only discover what we were thinking after writing it. Sometimes we think, oh, I know what that means. Now I'm going to write it. But I think if we're open to the writing, if the art really is important for us, then the art can take over, and it can become something else. So, um, there's part of me that wants to say it's, um, catharsis, but another part of me wants to say it's just a continuation and just a reimagining of the difficulty. I think it just transforms it a bit, maybe, um, but it never takes it away entirely. There's still markers of it. I mean, I'm thinking about a veteran who might write a poem about war. My guess is that that veteran is still going to think about war after writing the poem. And the good thing is that, poetry and the arts and writing are always there for us. It's
Yeah.
always there for us.
So in a way, it's kind of an investigation of things in the past, a
Mm-hmm.
looking into perhaps in this poem, you're recalling, and admitting that you could only know just so much
Mm-hmm.
at that point in time. But it's a rumination on, it's a contemplation of, your past.
Mm-hmm.
I see a very nice, well, two comments. One, um, that in terms of cooking, the writer's brother looked at food and cooking as poetry. Growing up in Denmark, a very different cuisine, a different food environment. So, food as poetry is one. The other is, do you do journaling? Do you do sort of diary entries, and that then at a later point go back to those? Perhaps would be my extension of the question, to be the source or the seed for a poem.
Mm. Yeah. So, I used to journal a lot, and I'm a big proponent of it for anyone, whether they're wanting to write, more formally or just for the enjoyment or for recording memories. I used to journal quite a bit, probably through early college,
Hmm.
but I don't journal anymore in terms of a daily or weekly sort of, recording of things. But
Right.
I'm a big note taker. I'm always jotting down words and phrases and lines, and I like to enter them into my phone, and I especially like legal pads. I write a lot on legal pads,
Hmm.
um, and I would agree. And I've always thought about cooking, as poetry, and poetry is one of those terms also that is given to things when it's done really well and mysteriously. Uh, oh, it's poetry the way they have arranged this garden. It's poetic. But
And oftentimes
absolutely,
wine is poetry in a glass.
mm,
That's a phrase that's used.
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And the complexity of a wine, the complexity of food, or as a cook in LA for 2 decades, all the things that go into it. The pausing in a poem. Now you're making me think of as plating a dish. how it appears on the plate. So yeah, I think that's very apt. I like that comparison.
Very, very good. Well, excellent. Well, I think we're coming to the end of our time, Lee, but we certainly have appreciated your reading and your down-to-earth commenting about the process, and look forward to keeping in touch and keeping our eye on your poetry as it begins to appear elsewhere, or new things that are coming up. We know we've got you on our radar for sure after this visit, and putting a name to a face and a voice to a name makes us even that much more present when we're reading something of yours, given that we've heard you read today. So thank you so much again for taking the time to visit us here in this class, in this presentation. And I don't know, any final words from you before we just clock out?
Mm. Well, just briefly, if anyone would like to send in a poem to the California Arts Council, my project is to invite any and all Californians, any level of poetry writing experience, to write a poem about your town or your California as you see it. And we hope to have that up in the next month or two, but you can find that at the California Arts Council website. It's called Our California.
Okay.
And again, we hope we'll have that up in the next month or two. But otherwise, Robert, I just wanted to say thank you. It's been an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure for all of us. Thank you, Lee, and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. All righty.